The Ferris wheel stood frozen against the twilight, its iron arms silhouetted in rust and silence, unmoving above the fairground where once there had been laughter. That evening in late June, the county fair pulsed with neon and cotton candy dreams, a fevered heartbeat of small-town joy. But beneath the glitter and noise, something darker stirred. 15-year-old Elijah Hastings vanished between the midway and the parking lot, swallowed not by the crowd, but by something far more sinister. No one saw him leave. No one heard him scream. Within 72 hours, a man was in custody, charged and later convicted for Elijah's murder, but the boy himself was never found. His body never recovered. His story never truly closed. This tale begins not with answers, but with absence, and a question that has haunted an entire town for over a decade. How can justice be served when the truth remains buried? The morning after Elijah disappeared, sunlight broke over Ashgrove like a lie. Dew clung to the grass where his footprints had once been, fading with the hours. Volunteers gathered in swells, a sea of neighbors wearing sorrow-like armor as they combed through cornfields, drainage ditches, and abandoned sheds. Parents clutched their children tighter. Doors were now locked in daylight. It wasn't just that a boy had gone missing. It was that a piece of the town had been torn out without warning. And as dusk fell again over the empty fairgrounds, as the scent of fried dough still whispered on the air like a ghost, people began to ask not just where Elijah had gone, but if they'd ever truly known the boy or the man soon to be accused of taking him. Because what they found next would send a fracture through the town's heart that would never fully heal. His name was Darrell Kemp, 42 years old, pale-eyed, father of none, neighbor to all. He lived less than a mile from the fairgrounds in a weathered ranch house, seated behind a leaning cedar fence and a lawn perpetually 2 weeks overdue for mowing. On the outside, Darrell was a fixture of quiet normalcy, the kind of man who offered polite nods at gas stations and showed up at church potlucks with store-bought pies. But behind the closed curtains of his living room, something festered. He had a record not violent. Not initially, but one long enough to murmur unease when the police turned their attention to him. A trespassing charge here. A suspicious loitering report there. And then, just months before the fair, a call to the sheriff's office from a teenage girl claiming Darrell had followed her car for miles down a country back road. The report was logged. No charges were filed. But when they searched his property 3 days after Elijah vanished, they found something chilling. The boy's tattered hoodie, wedged beneath a tarp in Darrell's shed, the scent of motor oil, soaked deep into the faded cotton. The town exhaled relief, rage, disbelief. Their suspect had a name, but even then, justice felt like a story told half in shadow. The arrest was swift, almost surgical. Uniformed officers moved in just past dawn, their boots crunching over brittle gravel as they approached Darrell Kemp's front door. Inside, he was calm. Too calm. He didn't run, didn't argue. His hands trembled only slightly as they cuffed him. A mugshot soon followed, his blank stare frozen under harsh fluorescence. Ashgrove watched it unfold in real time, the local news treating the moment like a curtain call. But behind closed windows, whispers twisted like smoke. There was no blood, no body. Just a sweatshirt and a pattern of suspicion. Prosecutors leaned on circumstantial bricks to build their case. A timeline painstakingly pulled from surveillance tapes, phone records, and witness fragments barely laced together. The hoodie, found on Darrell's property, became both lifeline and noose, and though a jury would find him guilty, some still wondered not whether Darrell had done something terrible, but whether they had truly found the man who had pulled Elijah Hastings from their world into the void. It wasn't just the trial that divided Ashgrove. It was what the trial didn't offer. No motive that made sense. No confession. Darrell Kemp sat silently through most of it, unmoved, emotionless, as if the whole world had mistaken him for someone else. The defense pointed to weak forensic evidence. The hoodie had no blood, no DNA. No eyewitness ever placed Elijah with Darrell that night. A classmate claimed she saw Elijah walking toward the south exit of the fairground alone, but her memory faltered under cross-examination. Still, the jury returned a verdict in under 4 hours. Guilty. Murder in the first degree. A life sentence without parole. And yet, the courthouse steps echoed with an uncomfortable question as reporters packed up their gear. How do you bury a ghost when there is no grave? Elijah's parents clung to the verdict like a life preserver, but at night, alone, they still left the porch light on, just in case. Because without a body, hope does not die quietly, it lingers, and it haunts. Summer turned to fall, and the fairgrounds stood silent, empty rides rusting beneath a canopy of red and gold leaves. The popcorn carts were wheeled away, the banners folded and mothballed. Ashgrove tried to return to normal, but the hole Elijah left behind gaped wider with each passing season. Classrooms had one empty desk. The football team left a spot on their bench unclaimed. At the diner where his mother worked weekends, regulars avoided her eyes. And behind each awkward silence, the same question echoed. What if they'd been wrong? What if Darrell Kemp wasn't the monster they needed him to be, but merely the one most easily named? Because in the quiet spaces between grief, doubt crept in like fog thick, clinging, and inescapable. And in those moments, some in Ashgrove began to wonder if the true killer still roamed among them, masked by the very certainty they had clung to like salvation. 1 year passed, then 2. The scar on Ashgrove's collective heart became calloused but never closed. Rumors faded from bar stools and back pews, but a void lingered, unspeakable and raw. Miriam Hastings, Elijah's mother, kept every missing poster in a drawer that wouldn't shut. Her husband, David, landscaped their backyard into silence, planting trees where Elijah once played, each root a whispered prayer beneath the soil. Every so often, a false lead would reignite old fires, a boy seen in Omaha who matched Elijah's height, a hitchhiker in Georgia who knew his name, but they all ended the same. Dead ends. Misremembered faces, grief redressed as hope. And still, the porch light glowed each night like a beacon through endless fog, because somewhere under the weight of time and verdicts and voiceless justice, the question remained unanswered. Where was Elijah Hastings? If not with Darrell Kemp, then with who? If not gone, then why hadn't he come home? In the 3rd year, just as autumn bled into winter and the trees turned brittle with frost, a break came, but not the kind anyone had hoped for. An anonymous letter arrived at the Ashgrove Gazette, typed, unsigned, smeared slightly with what smelled like motor oil. It read only, "Check the bridge where the train whistles never stop." The editor, unsure whether to laugh or alert the authorities, chose both. Deputies followed the cryptic clue to a rusted bridge on the outskirts of town where the tracks always echoed too loudly, too late at night. Beneath the old railroad trestle, scrawled in red spray paint barely visible against crumbling stone, were the words, "I watched him fall." Forensics dated the paint to the week prior. But there were no prints, no evidence, no Elijah. The town flinched. Some said it was a cruel prank. Others believed it was a confession smuggled by guilt. The sheriff said nothing, but behind his silence, the same fear stirred again, that somewhere in the cold spaces where fairgrounds once bloomed, the truth was still half buried, watching, waiting, and far from finished. The bridge was sealed off for a week, but no further clues emerged. Beneath the steel lattice smeared with wind and rust, only old graffiti and forgotten bottles whispered back. Still, the letter lingered in the minds of everyone who read it, a riddle tattooed in silence. Why there? Why now? Miriam stood on that bridge one early morning, wrapped in Elijah's old track jacket, eyes sweeping the horizon beyond the rails. She imagined the whistle of the train as a lullaby meant for ghosts, imagined her son's silhouette in every shifting fog bank beneath. I watched him fall. The words gnawed at her heart like teeth. Was it metaphor or testimony? How do you grieve a son who might still breathe? For the Hastings, And for Ashgrove, grief had never been linear. It looped and rewound, circling back around cold facts and colder absences. And still the porch light burned, still the fairground shadows stretched long, and still no body, no goodbye, no peace. 4 years after Elijah vanished, in the pale thaw of an Ashgrove spring, something unexpected surfaced, not bone, not cloth, but sound. A podcaster named Clara Wren, producer of the regional true crime series Echoes of Nowhere, reached out to the Hastings family. She had stumbled upon the case while researching cold convictions with no recovered remains. What drew her in wasn't missing data. It was the noise, the silence around Elijah's disappearance that rang too clean, like a stage meticulously swept after the curtain call. Clara spent 3 months in Ashgrove, speaking softly into a microphone in kitchens, gas stations, and a long-forgotten janitor's closet at Elijah's old school. Each recorded memory painted not just a portrait of a missing boy, but of a town that had shape-shifted under the weight of unresolved pain. And then, in editing the 6th episode, buried in a re-recorded interview with a retired ride technician from the fair, Clara heard something, a background voice, faint beneath the hum of cicadas. It whispered, "Don't go yet." She adjusted her levels, played it back. The voice repeated, male, trembling, urgent. Someone had been near Elijah that night. Someone had watched him walk away and done nothing. Or worse. The tape, once dismissed as ambient noise, became a scream muffled by time. Clara traced the old technician's shift schedule, narrowed down the time of his interview, and returned to the fairgrounds, now a skeleton of cracked pavement and rust-bitten scaffolding. She retraced Elijah's last steps using sun-faded maps and half-forgotten maintenance logs. Behind the carousel, she found an old security booth left to decay, its window panes fractured like ice. Inside was a drawer containing weather-warped tapes reel-to-reels from the penultimate night of Elijah's life. They hadn't been digitized, logged, or reviewed. Clara brought them to a local audio preservationist, and as hours turned into nights, one tape crackled to life with grainy pops and fractured silence. Then, unmistakably, footsteps. A sob, and a boy's voice, quiet but desperate. "Please. Please. Let me go." Clara froze. The technician had heard something real. Not wind, not imagination, but a child pleading in a forgotten corner of a place built for dreams. The sound was dated June 23rd, 11:12 p.m., 20 minutes after Elijah was last seen. The tape was real, the voice was real, and the silence that followed was no longer innocent. The recording reignited an investigation long since shelved in dust and resignation. The sheriff's department, now under new leadership, reopened the case under public pressure, but Clara had already lit a wildfire of attention online. Downloads of Echoes of Nowhere swelled into the millions, and with them came experts, armchair detectives, and cryptic messages flooding inboxes and tip lines alike. One message, sent anonymously just days after the tape went public, provided GPS coordinates to an old maintenance tunnel under the fairgrounds sealed off since a fire in the late 1990s. Clara, armed with a flashlight and permission from the town zoning board, descended into the darkness. The tunnel wove like a ribcage beneath the surface, cluttered with rotting signage and twisted wire. At its far end, she found what hadn't been found before: a patch of disturbed soil beneath a rust-red tarp, stitched shut with fraying rope. She didn't open it. She called the sheriff instead, and as the coroner arrived, eyes grim beneath a spring dusk, the town of Ashgrove held its breath again, not for justice, but for truth. A truth buried under their feet all along. The tarp, brittle and wet with years of forgotten rainwater, was peeled away with care and trembling gloves. Beneath it lay the remains of a child bones, delicate as bird wings, tangled in the tatters of a hoodie long faded, the same one once found in Darrell Kemp's shed. Dental records confirmed what many suspected but never dared speak aloud. It was Elijah. At last, the boy who vanished on a summer night returned to his town not as rumor or memory, but as truth. The revelation shattered what was left of the fragile certainty Ashgrove had clung to. Darrell Kemp had always denied harming Elijah, and now there was proof he hadn't hidden the body. Apologies could not undo the years. Justice, once claimed, was exposed anew as a false crown. Miriam collapsed when they told her, but not from shock, from relief, heavy and sharp as a thunderclap. They would finally bury their son, place flowers over his name, write an end to a sentence long dangling in the wind. Yet beneath that closure, a colder story took root. Someone else had led Elijah down into that quiet tunnel. Someone still unknown. The truth had risen, yes, but the mystery remained, and in Ashgrove, the shadows stirred again. 3 days after Elijah was laid to rest beneath a maple tree in the town cemetery, the town woke to a message burned into the fairground's chain-link gate charcoal letters, scrawled with fierce precision. "You buried the wrong truth." Investigators dismissed it as vandalism, but Clara Wren knew better. The phrasing, the symbolism, the choice of location, it all echoed the brutal symmetry of a story still unfinished. She combed through police reports once sealed and quietly ignored, following a thread few dared to pull. A pattern of disappearances in neighboring counties, children whose fates trembled with eerie echoes of Elijah's. A missing girl in Baxter Ridge, last seen near a summer carnival. A runaway in Milford with a scribbled note that simply read, "Too loud here." The stories had not connected. Not until now. Clara stared at her growing map pins, strings, fragments, and saw it. A constellation of vanishing stars, all orbiting the same silence. The truth wasn't just hidden. It was moving, living, waiting. And while Elijah's body had finally come home, his murderer may have never left. Somewhere out there in the rotting spine of forgotten fairgrounds and Summer's End, the hunter remained, cloaked in the myth of false endings, and the story whispered one final vow: he would not be the last. Clara did not sleep that night. Her walls, once bare, were now claustrophobic with evidence maps, photographs, transcripts, worn yellowed files with names long since buried beneath the noise of new tragedies. She listened again to the recording that had cracked the case open, this time not for the voice of a pleading boy, but for sounds in the background, the time-stamped heartbeat of that lost night. She heard the creak of metal, the unmistakable chime of a ticket booth bell. And then, something else. A laugh. Low, coarse, stretched not with joy but with menace. She isolated it, enhanced it, and somewhere in the distortion, Clara heard a voice she recognized from an earlier interview. Not Darrell. Someone else. Someone who'd hidden in plain sight, wearing age and grief like camouflage. Breaking into a cold sweat, Clara picked up the phone to call the sheriff, but the line was already dead. Across town, Miriam's porch light flickered for the first time in years, and far beyond Ashgrove, past the broken rail lines and rusted fences, another fairground lit up in the night. New town, new faces, old secrets. The cycle had begun again. The sheriff called in a special task force, their arrival cloaked in quiet urgency. Clara met them behind closed doors with audio files and timelines, suspect profiles scrawled in looping red ink. The voice from the tape matched partially with Harold Greeley, a retired carny who had worked the circuit across 3 counties for nearly 2 decades. On paper, Harold was a ghost. No family, no fixed address. His last employment before Elijah's disappearance, listed simply as temporary grounds operations. Yet, in every town hit by those vanishing children, Harold logged hours behind ticket booths and ride panels. Clara pieced together payroll slips, parole records, and faded photographs. In one, taken at Milford's summer fair, Harold stood barely in frame, near a toddler's ride, same baseball cap, same sun-worn jacket, an eerie mirror of a man glimpsed in Ashgrove's own fairground security footage from 2012. It had been overlooked before, dismissed as background. Now, it pulsed with terrible clarity. The darkness hadn't passed through once. It had circled back time and again, disguised as harmless routine. The hunter hadn't fled when Elijah vanished. He had stayed. He had watched. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was watching still. They tracked Harold Greeley to a weather-worn trailer deep in the timber country beyond Langley Creek, its dented shell half swallowed by moss and shadow. When agents arrived, wind hissed through limp pine branches like breath held too long. No barking dogs. No flicker of motion. Just the creak of rusty chains swaying on a porch swing that hadn't known laughter in years. Inside, the air clung heavy with dust and gasoline. Stacks of fairground memorabilia lined the walls. Banners, rigged plush toys, torn admittance stubs arranged like trophies. And on the far table, a box. Inside, a collection of cassette tapes, some labeled by towns, others by initials. Underneath them, folded plastic evidence bags, each containing trinkets, beads, shoelaces, faded keychains. The task force stood frozen, without confession, without camera footage, without another name spoken. The implications screamed louder than any siren. Harold had not killed randomly. He had collected memories, prizes, echoes. Greeley was gone, vanished again. But this time, the footprints he left behind led through a decade of unanswered prayers. And though Elijah Hastings had come home, the path he walked lit the way to dozens more. The fairground lights may dim, towns may bury their dead, but the truth has a scent, and the hunt was no longer silent. It had a name, it had a face, and Clara wasn't about to look away. 2 months later, Clara sat once more beneath the old maple tree in Ashgrove Cemetery, where the wind traced somber hymns through rustling leaves. At her feet lay a copy of the latest report confirmed matches between the cold cases and items found in Harold Greeley's trailer. 5 children, once thought runaways, now finally named. Ashgrove had become more than a memory of a crime. It had become a memorial to truths denied for too long. Miriam Hastings knelt in silence beside her son's grave, fingers brushing the etched letters like they were skin. She placed a paper crane at its base, folded from one of Elijah's last school essays. Hope Through Chaos, the title read. The hunt was not over, the wounds not closed, but in naming the horror they had once refused to see, Ashgrove found the beginning of an answer. Not redemption, not peace, but something deeper: truth, pulled from shadow, finally given voice. And when the fair came again 5 summers later, it arrived not with fanfare, but with reverence. A single banner stretched over the entrance. In memory, in warning, never again. But evil is rarely vanquished in full. It only sleeps, moves, changes its mask. Clara Wren kept digging, even as the headlines cooled, and Ashgrove exhaled the weight it had carried for years. One morning, in the brittle light of late autumn, a postal package arrived at her door, no return address, the faint scent of sawdust and iron clinging to the cardboard. Inside, an old fairground token pressed into a velvet pouch. No note. No context. Just a single coin, embossed with the words, "Admit one to the darkness beneath." Clara turned it over in her hands, feeling the coldness bloom in her fingertips. For a long moment, the hallway clock was her only company. Then she reached for her recorder and whispered into the microphone, voice trembling but firm. It isn't over. Because some stories bleed past their final pages, folded into the places we pretend are safe. Because sometimes, the fair comes back not to entertain, but to remember. And when the lights flicker against the horizon again, we will ask the same question Elijah Hastings left behind. Who watches when no one else sees? And will we be ready to see them back? She closed the recorder and stepped outside, the late autumn wind churning leaves in spirals that felt too deliberate, too mournful. Across towns and timelines, Clara had unearthed a pattern of missing voices, forsaken truths, and a darkness older than any single crime. They said Elijah's case was over. The grave was marked, the villain named, but as she stood beneath the dimming sky, the token's metal chill still lingering in her pocket, she knew the cycle breathes through silence. Somewhere, Another child might be walking toward the soft glow of carnival light, unaware of the eyes that waited, cloaked behind laughter and prizes. Truth had spoken once, but it demands to be listened to again, because monsters do not vanish with the gavel's strike. They learn to smile better, hide deeper, wait longer. And so, Clara began to write not an ending, but a warning carved in tape and ink, memory and bone, a reckoning for all the stories never told. She titled it simply, The Fairgrounds, Part 1. In the months that followed, Clara's investigation splintered into a dozen tributaries, each leading not just to suspects or cases, but to questions that tugged at the borders of what a town chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. Her podcast became something more than a chronicle. It was a ledger of ghosts, of truths exiled by fear. Survivors reached out. Families of the lost sent names, pictures, notes, never meant for daylight. In her apartment, Clara kept them all organized in files, labeled not by case number, but by first names, each folder a light that once flickered and faded unseen. And as winter drew down, her voice became a hymn for the missing, echoing across headphones and headlines, binding scattered stories into one looming narrative. Somewhere out there, beyond Ashgrove, beyond Elijah's grave, and the miles of silent roads tethered by carnival wire, the darkness still lingered reeling, waiting, disguising itself as joy. But now, it was known, no longer faceless, no longer allowed to feed in silence. And as Clara clicked record on her next file, the words etched with new fire, she knew this wasn't the last chapter. It was only the pause before the next scream pierced the dusk. The fair would come again, and this time, the world would be watching. On the anniversary of Elijah's disappearance, Clara stood once more at the edge of the fairgrounds now overgrown, reclaimed by thorn and time. The Ferris wheel, long dismantled, had left a circular rust ring like an echo on the earth. She held a new file in her hand, another town, another name. A boy vanished beneath the amber glow of a traveling fair in Iowa. Behind her, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest jingle of metal, as if a ride long gone had stirred from slumber. Clara turned, but nothing moved. Still, the truth pulsed beneath her feet, like a second heartbeat in the soil. The darkness was not an aberration of one place or moment. It was a traveling thing, stitched into the canvas of carefree joy, shifting faces, new names, same silence. She pressed record one last time. Her voice, familiar yet edged with steel, pierced the crisp evening. Episode 1. Everywhere the fair has been. And then she walked forward, trailing light into the place's nightmare once wore a mask of wonder. The world had watched Ashgrove, listened to Clara, mourned Elijah, and now, beyond headlines and ghost lights, a reckoning stirred in every town with dust-coated booths and forgotten Ferris wheels. Lawmakers initiated conversations they'd postponed for decades. Fairs began to implement background checks, install real-time surveillance, publish safe exit protocols. But Clara knew policy could never trace madness back to its source, not when evil dressed itself as whimsy. In her quiet moments, she returned to the recordings, not to edit but to listen, for what was lost, for what might still speak. In one, the voice of Elijah looped gently in the background, half laughter, half breath. "Almost there," he says. And Clara, ever the witness, ever the voice, whispered back into the microphone, answering not just for Elijah, but for them all. "We hear you. We're still listening." And with that, the screen faded not to black, but to a carousel light igniting in the distance, turning slowly, solemnly, forever. Beneath the carousel's faint hum, as it turned once more onto the screen like a sun rising through memory, the echo of Elijah Hastings lingered longer than the image itself. His story, Clara realized, had become that strange kind of truth that bore no retelling without reshaping the listener. Across 1,000 miles of fractured recollections, late-night interviews, and earth stirred by lost innocence, what endured was not just loss but defiance. Ashgrove was no longer just a site of disappearance. It was a monument to reckoning, a town that taught the world how to look closely at the smiles that hide shadows, to never let silence masquerade as peace. As Clara archived one final tape into her growing vault of voices, she paused not in closure, but in reverence. For Elijah. For the children still missing. For the ones who would now be seen, and in that steady flicker of carousel light fading into the dusk behind her, she saw something not often found in the aftermath of terror. She saw resolve, and perhaps, for the first time, something like hope. Years from now, long after the ride tickets yellowed to dust and the lights faded from memory, there would be those who still remembered Ashgrove not for its tragedy, but for its awakening. The fair didn't vanish. Not entirely, it became a symbol reclaimed, remade, a place where parents clung tighter to their children, where strangers looked twice, where silence was no longer the lingua franca of pain. Memorial plaques now lined the rebuilt midway, each engraved with a name, a date, and one promise etched in brass. Never unseen again. And though evil moves like wind through carnival tents, ever shifting, ever returning, its path was marked now, haunted by voices that would not be silenced. In one final recording, archived in Clara's series, the carousel slows to a stop as laughter fades into silence. Then, in a child's voice, clear and bright, a whisper, "Tell them I mattered." And the world, scarred but stirring, whispered back, "We will." And so the legend of Elijah Hastings came to rest not in obscurity, but in the marrow of a generation that chose to remember. His name became a warning, told in classrooms and whispered behind rolling trucks of traveling carnivals. Parents cited his story as sacred scripture, a caution not against joy, but against blindness. The fair still came new towns, new banners, gleaming lights, but behind every smile, there lingered awareness. Awareness forged not in fear, but in fierce remembrance. Clara's voice endured too, not as a star, but as a guide etched into podcasts, documentaries, and the consciousness of those who choose to see clearly what others preferred buried. And while acts of cruelty never disappeared entirely, the darkness that once slipped through unchecked now faced mirrors it could no longer escape. For every carousel turning in twilight, there stood now a witness, and for every child with wide eyes and cotton candy fingers, there echoed in the distance one unwavering vow: no more vanished voices, no more silent goodbyes, not while the story still burns. In time, the story of Elijah Hastings became more than a singular tragedy etched into a town's soul. It became a movement. Schools adopted curriculum focused on awareness and safety. Communities built networks to protect the vulnerable, and fairground workers across the country felt the tide shift beneath their feet. It was not justice that endured, nor even vengeance, it was vigilance, born of heartbreak and carried by those who could no longer look away. Clara Wren's microphone now gathered dust, her work complete, her vow fulfilled. She returned years later, not as a journalist, but as a quiet guest at a small candlelit vigil beneath the maple tree in Ashgrove. Children played nearby, laughter real but watched. On her lap, a book of names, testimonies once lost, now preserved. As dusk fell and the fair's distant lights blinked like fireflies across memory's horizon, Clara whispered the last words she would ever record. Not all monsters hide, some simply wait, but so do we, and we are no longer afraid. As the candle flames wavered in the hush of evening, each flicker seemed to echo names that had once gone unspoken, each glow warming the places where silence had once ruled. Clara sat still beneath the heavy branches of the maple, her breath slow, her gaze distant. The town of Ashgrove, forever changed, pulsed with a rhythm steadier than truth, fuller than justice. This wasn't the end, not for Elijah, not for the others, not for the fairgrounds that would one day return, but it was a place to stop, to breathe, to remember. Around her, voices murmured thanks, stories flowed quiet as prayer, and the wind carried the rustling leaves like a requiem and a promise. Somewhere far away, a ride creaked back to life under a new sky. But here, tonight, under stars glazed with memory and vigilance, Clara Wren closed her eyes. She had kept her vow, Ashgrove had answered. And the world was watching. Still. Years rolled forward like slow-turning wheels, and Clara's name receded from headlines, yet never from the lips of those she had helped find their voices again. The fair came and went, now flanked by silent stewards, signs, counselors, cameras. Children laughed as they always had, but behind the laughter stood vigilance, born of remembrance. Elijah's name became part of ceremonies, school speeches, whispered bedtime reassurances. Some called it healing, others reckoning. But for Clara, who now walked quietly among the living with the weight of the missing tucked gently in her memories, it was legacy. Her recordings found their place in libraries, taught in classrooms, folded into the fabric of a generation that had learned to listen, to believe, to protect. And though the fairground lights may once again tempt fate, spin illusions, cast shadows, they shall never again glow unseen. Beneath every spotlight now lives a story, and in every town the fair visits, there echoes one single vow: not while we remember, not again, never in silence. Somewhere, under a moonlit sky fractured by clouds and nostalgia, the fair spins once more bright, unyielding, echoing through the heartbeat of a nation changed by loss, sharpened by truth. It arrives in a new town, trucks grumbling down quiet streets, lights unfurling like flowers across dusk. But this time, eyes are open, shadows still stretch beneath rides, but they are watched now, recorded, bound by the weight of remembrance. Elijah Hastings lives not just in tombstone or tale, but in policy, in vigilance, in every shared story that breaks the silence evil once depended on. Clara's voice fades from airwaves, but her echo remains, not as ghost, but as guide a signal never lost, calling out in static and memory. And though monsters may still weave their way beneath canvas and cheer, they no longer move unseen. For now, standing at every gate, behind every light, inside every parent's promise, there exists a sentinel forged from grief and fire, and the vow is etched deeper than ever: no more lost children, not ever again. And so, the carousel slows not from fatigue, but from purpose. A symbol now, not of escape, but of remembrance. The fairground's painted horses, once blind sentinels to sorrow, stand still beneath floodlights installed with care, with caution, with memory. In a corner of Ashgrove's new midway stands a plaque, small, bronze, humble, inscribed simply, Elijah Hastings, 1997, 2000, and 12. Seen, heard, remembered. Visitors pose. Some cry. Others bow their heads. And children, tugging cotton candy fingers from their parents' hands, ask who he was. Each time the answer varies, but the message remains. He was the boy we almost forgot. But we didn't. Not forever. And that, perhaps, is where the story truly ends. Not with silence, not with vengeance, but with the stubborn, radiant act of remembering. For as long as one voice tells the tale, as long as carousel lights cut through twilight like truth through fog, the vow endures. Not again, not unseen, not in vain. And the fair, at last, spins on not just for joy, but for justice. Years from now, when the last of the tape hiss fades and Clara's name becomes footnote to history, the memory of Elijah Hastings will settle into something quieter, less a headline, more a heartbeat beneath the surface of a different world. A world made slightly safer by his absence, slightly braver by those who refused to forget him. On a quiet hill overlooking Ashgrove, a new generation gathers every June. Not in mourning, but in pledge. Children place paper cranes in the grass. Stories are read aloud, not of monsters, but of watchers of people daring enough to look straight into the shadows and speak. They do not need to know every detail, every ache. They only need to believe the truth matters. One boy vanished, and in finding him, the world learned to listen. Not in whispers, in chorus. And as dusk wraps the town in gold again, the carousel turns once more below. Not for escape, not for thrill, but for a promise sealed in light, forever turning, forever heard. And perhaps that is how legends linger, not as ghosts that haunt, but as truths that illuminate. Long after the fair packs up and the summer stars shift, Elijah's story remains etched into the seams of a nation more awake than before. In each flicker of carnival light, there exists now a reckoning. In every parent's steady hand and every child's cautious gaze, a promise. The silence that once fed the dark can no longer thrive. Not when stories like Elijah's are told again and again, until they are no longer forgotten. And somewhere, Clara Wren, older now, settled into her quiet life miles from Ashgrove, looks out onto her own small town and sees a fair in the distance rising anew. She doesn't fear it, because memory lives here now. She smiles, gently places a paper crane on her windowsill, and lets the wind carry the final echo. A whisper, not of sadness, but of guardianship. You are seen, you are heard, you are remembered. And so in the softness of twilight, where memory and silence kissed at the edge of every fairground shadow, the legend of Elijah Hastings became not a tragedy etched in sorrow, but a compass carried forward. The town of Ashgrove breathed him in like rain after drought, not as a wound, but as an oath. His name, once cried through missing posters and courtroom nights, now lingered in songs sung by children, in safety signs posted at every entrance to joy. Clara's recordings faded but unforgotten became heritage, archived beneath glass and ink in libraries and lighthouses of learning. In them was the sound of a world waking up, and as the world spun on, as new lights rose and shadows dared again to shift, that vow remained spoken not always aloud, but burned into the bones of those who knew. No more silence, no more forgetting, because when the carousel turns under a new dusk, the whisper returns too, soft and enduring. We see you, we remember. And this time, that truth will never vanish again. And beneath that final whisper, we see you, we remember, the silence did not return. In Ashgrove and far beyond, justice was no longer a courtroom verdict, but a flame kept alight by remembrance, vigilance, and love. Elijah Hastings, the boy who vanished. The voice once lost became the seed of 1,000 safeguards, the echo in every shadowed corner, the reason eyes paused a little longer on strangers passing beneath glittering lights. His story, once only grief, had grown into myth, not to frighten, but to forge. In every banner that reads, "Safe Fair starts here," in every paper crane tucked behind school photos, in every warm hand that clasps a child's as the carousel begins to turn, Elijah is there not in mourning, but in watchfulness. The fairgrounds may spin forever, towns may rise and fall, but that vow, that luminous, unwavering vow, will remain written on sky and soil alike, not unseen, not voiceless, not forgotten, never again. Beneath a twilight sky peppered with stars and years, the fair turns once more in quiet homage not to oblivion, but to memory. The carousel's painted horses gleam under floodlights that now double as beacons, not just for joy, but for vigilance born of loss. In Ashgrove, where silence once blanketed pain, voices rise now with purpose. Miriam Hastings walks annually to the fair entrance, placing a white paper crane on the latch of the front gate, her ritual, soft but resolute. Around her, children laugh, but always within earshot of careful parents, watchful volunteers, and the unseen network built on Elijah's name. Clara's recordings play through museum speakers nearby, not as warnings, but as lamplight against the dark. The past does not linger to paralyze, but to guide. And as winds carry the sound of laughter and gears turning once more into the evening air, the legacy of one vanished boy endures neither ghost nor martyr, but guardian, in every light, in every precaution, in every fair rising into the dusk, forever witnessed, forever known. And so, as the final ride slows and the night deepens, The story of Elijah Hastings gently folds into history, not forgotten but embraced, not mourned only, but honored. In Ashgrove and the towns beyond, every fairground now stands as a vigil, a breath held between joy and remembrance. The carousel never spins without bearing his name in spirit, and every child's laughter echoes slightly louder, fortified by care. The world did not return to what it was before Elijah vanished, because it chose not to. It chose to learn, to carry him forward, to etch his voice into the places where innocence and danger so often met. And though time moves and faces change, the vow lives in perpetual bloom. We see you, we remember, and we will never let you be lost again. Beneath every floodlight, on every midway path, through dusk and dawn the truth shines. The fair turns, we watch, we listen, and we never forget. In the hush that follows all endings, there is clarity, not loud, not triumphant, but certain. Ashgrove stands now not as a wound, but as a beacon, and Elijah Hastings is no longer only a boy lost to shadows, but a voice carried by thousands who once felt silenced. The fair continues its circuit, town to town, its lights awakening the sky, but behind every glowing bulb there pulses a shared memory. A memory not of fear, but of unflinching watching. And, as generations turn forward like worn pages, his name remains etched in the breath between laughter and caution. Elijah's story did not vanish in sorrow, it transformed. It became a signal, a reminder, a vow sewn invisibly into every ride ticket, every guarded glance, every echo of a mother's prayer beneath floodlit dusk. And as wind whips through painted banners high above wheels and wonder, a whisper lingers in its curl. You are not alone. Never again. End of section. As dawn casts golden strokes across Ashgrove, the fairground sleeps, wrapped in mist and memory. The world stirs gently, touched not by sirens or sorrow, but by a deeper resonance, the kind that lives beneath the surface of silence and vows. A child tugs their parent's hand, pointing toward the carousel, its horses still, as if listening. On the ticket booth, a simple sign reads, "For Elijah and all the ones we watch for now." Beneath the roots of this place, beneath the laughter and gears, lies a truth unearthed pain, shaped into promise. The last echo, soft as wings through morning air, rises like a prayer not yet finished, never unseen. Never again. And in the quiet that follows, Ashgrove breathes. The fair begins, and hope, once lost in shadows, rides with us into the light. And so, with morning sunlight unfurling across the midway like a final promise, the story closes not in despair, but in vigilance wrapped in grace. Elijah Hastings, once lost to the depths of night, now walks alongside every child stepping beneath the fair's glowing arch. His voice remains whispering through wind-spun banners, pulsing beneath the rhythm of safety protocols, echoing in the careful hush of parents who have learned to see. Ashgrove's grief became a map, and Clara Wren's voice, a compass, guiding the world through silence into sight. The fair spins again, as it always will. But now, it spins with memory, with meaning, with watchful hearts stitched into every turn. The final whisper does not vanish. It settles like morning dew, soft, constant, enduring. We see you. We remember. We guard this joy because of you. And wherever the fair may travel next, Elijah travels with it, not lost in the dark, but blazing, quietly, in every light we now refuse to turn off. And so it ends. Not with the silence of a boy never found, but with the steady hum of a town that chose to listen. The carousel slows, its echo now legacy, not elegy. The ghosts that once wandered the edges of joy have faces now, names, stories that will never again be tucked beneath the canvas folds of forgetfulness. Elijah Hastings walks with each of us not in fear, but in fierce remembrance, stitched into every banner that flutters beneath golden lights. In the places where darkness once waited and watched, there now stands something brighter, braver, A mother's vow, a town's awakening, a storyteller's echo. And as the last ride winds down, as dawn kisses the spokes of memory one last time, there it remains. Not a mystery unresolved, but a truth reclaimed. We remember. We remain. And the fair spins on for Elijah, and for every child who now walks beneath its lights, seen,